Chinese President Xi Jinping concluded his state visit to Russia on Wednesday after 3 days of talks with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, during which both leaders signed 2 joint statements to deepen their comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for the new era and pre-2030 development plan on priorities in China-Russia economic cooperation. Both Putin and Xi expressed serious concern over NATO's continued strengthening of military security ties with the Asia-Pacific countries, which they said undermined regional peace and stability, and vowed to build an equal, open and inclusive security system to counter the Indo-Pacific strategy pursued by the United States. China described President Xi's trip to Moscow, which is his 9th since he first became the Chinese president in March 2013, as one of friendship, cooperation and peace. Russian President Vladimir Putin hailed the Russian-Chinese cooperation as the one with unlimited possibilities and prospects. Now, what kind of impetus will this meeting between presidents of China and Russia add to their bilateral relationship? Will the new declaration on development of key areas of economic cooperation between the two countries give a new lifeline to Russia in the face of heavy international sanctions? Also, how does the West look at this cementing of friendship between China and Russia? All this and much more on this edition of the Global Debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena. To talk about the symbolism and outcomes of Xi Jinping's Moscow visit, I have with me an illustrious panel. So let me begin by introducing them to you. Delighted to welcome on the program Ms. Rory Daniels, Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, the US. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Monnier, Vice President of Asia Center, Paris, France. Mr. Oliver McPherson-Smith, Research Fellow, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. And Mr. Benjamin Ho, Assistant Professor, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU, Singapore. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today on Sansad TV. Ms. Daniels, allow me to begin the program today with you. So, you know, the visit of President Xi Jinping to Moscow was very, very symbolic. But how high was it on substance, according to you?
I think it was actually relatively light on substance, but in some ways the symbolism is a big part of the substance that both leaders want to achieve out of the meeting. So both leaders are really aligned around an ideology at home that excuses some of the governance problems that they have in each of their countries by painting themselves as victims of a Western-led international order. So instead of focusing on some of the common rules of the international order that Russia has violated, such as its sovereignty violation against Ukraine, they're really focused on creating a sense that the West has made them victims. And I think that symbolism is equally important in many ways to Russia and China's domestic political agenda as some of the deliverables that you would typically expect out of a state visit.
Dr. Monnier, considering that this was President Xi Jinping's 9th visit to Moscow since he became president in 2013, but the first since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, how significant is this according to you, both from China's perspective as well as Moscow?
Well, obviously, it was an opportunity that was missed for everyone, I think. China had to do it. They were invited. Russia was in deep trouble in the war. And of course, from the viewpoint of Ukraine, there was nothing new. I mean, that was, as you said, the 9th visit, but it's also the 41st encounter between Xi Jinping and President Putin. And we know what they talked about. There was statements about commercial agreement, and I agree with Rory, that was not very substantial. We know what they didn't talk about, and that was the suffering of the Ukrainian people, the suffering of the Russian families who lost their people and their sons. And so from the European point of view, of course, it's a major disappointment because Xi Jinping didn't take this opportunity to call and return the calls from Volodymyr Zelensky. He could have done that, didn't happen. And we believe that his 10-point plan, or 12-point plan, sorry, that was issued on February 24th is really a general statement, but it's not an engagement and a broker posture on the part of China. That was meant to send a message to the rest of the world as opposed to trying to get a solution worked out.
Dr. Benjamin, before we get your perspective on, what China and Russia have said on the Ukraine war and what the Chinese peace plan is all about, in terms of economic partnership, if we look at first, how significant do you think is this one for China? What does China stand to gain from the economic partnership that they have just announced? In fact, both sides go on to say that this will usher in a new era in their partnership. Do you see that happening?
Well, I think the reality is China is in a much stronger position economically, and it certainly has much more leverage over Russia as compared to Russia having any leverage over China. I think Russia recognizes that if it doesn't, that it has only China as a strategic partner to sort of rely on. My view from the meeting is that what is significant about the meeting, in my view at least, is that there is a meeting at all. And I think we need to recognize that this meeting is, at least in terms of its optics, if you just last week you had the leaders of South Korea and Japan meeting, and not too long ago you had the US, British, and Australian leaders all meeting. So I think the fact that again, I don't know whether it's a reaction to those previous meetings, but certainly having Xi and Putin meet suggests that it's at least to show the world that there is some kind of it's a political signal very much to the world to demonstrate the strategic partnership between Russia and China.
Dr. Smith, so in that sense, how do you see this for Russia? And because it comes just days after the ICC's arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin because of the war crimes, how significant is it for Vladimir Putin? What does it mean for his international standing?
I think it's hugely significant for a variety of different reasons. First and foremost, it's confirmation. Yes, it was a largely symbolic visit, but that symbolism counts for something. And it's confirmation that the partnership, the alliance that's everything but an alliance in name, is functioning and continues. It's secondly significant because it confirms that within this partnership, Russia is definitely the junior partner here, as Professor Ben was just saying. And moreover, we see that it's evidenced by the different discussions we're seeing from both sides around the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, the Sila Sibiri 2. The Russian side was incredibly enthusiastic and keen to overplay perhaps the development of this pipeline, which would bring natural gas from Siberia to Russia. The Chinese side, however, was naturally a little bit more coy about this. And the third takeaway from all this is that it's evident to me that President Xi is learning lessons from the war in Ukraine. It's evident that President Xi doesn't want to become wholly reliant on the Russian Federation for its hydrocarbons, the way in which Europe was 2 years ago, up until really a year ago. And they're learning that they don't want to get stuck in that dynamic once again. So there are several key takeaways I think we can learn from what's being said, and more importantly, perhaps what's not being said.
Ms. Daniels, if I talk about China's peace plan, and what we've increasingly been seeing is China emerging as the new peace broker. Just a few weeks ago, we saw China playing a major role in how Iran and Saudi relationship, have ushered in a new era. Do you see that happening in the case of Ukraine as well? They came up with a 12-point peace plan, which, of course, the West and particularly Ukraine is quite skeptical about. But what really do you think China is trying to gain by emerging as this new global peacemaker?
Well, I think China is trying to bolster its international image. I think it has domestic reasons to do that. I think there are expectations of the Chinese people that China should play a leadership role in the world. And I think it also has practical value for China to be engaged with some regions and areas where the US has long played a role, but has not particularly been able to bring about resolutions to some intractable problems. However, I think that China can only do that type of work if there are two willing partners. So in the case of the Middle East, it is clear that the partners were willing to come together and reach an agreement. In the case of Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe, and the United States, all of the parties to that conflict are not in a place where they're ready to sit down and reach an agreement. And I think that the peace plan that China offered in Ukraine was quite light on actual substance as well. It was much more a statement of principles than it was a plan to eventually mediate and end the conflict. So I think, China is doing its part to take advantage of situations where parties are willing to sit down and negotiate. But it is not in itself a driver of those negotiations as much as a broker of parties who are ready.
Dr. Monia, what does Europe want China to do if it really wants to be the peacemaker, if the Ukraine war has to stop? It's been more than 1 year with massive global implications. The fact is that the most vulnerable countries are suffering the most. The war has to have an outcome. So to now, at least take it to some kind of conclusion, if China is being looked at a country that could mediate, that could bring about peace, but it's just a statement and there is the peace plan lacks substance, what is it that Europe, what is it that the West would like China to add to it, to add that substance which is currently missing?
Teena, it's interesting. I was meeting with a Chinese official a few months ago, and he was complaining because the image of the image of China in Europe was terrible. The sentiment was bad. Of course, there was COVID, but now the war was happening, and he said, "What can we do to improve the image of China in Europe?" And I said, "You can stop the war." And he asked me, "How do you do that?" Well, you engage with Russia in a strength arm wrestling, and you tell them, if you don't do that, we'll do this and that. And he said, "No, we cannot do that." He apologized. So indeed, that's what Europe would like. Europe wants an end to this war. It is hurting us. We have refugees all over. It is terrible. But at this point, we have to recognize that, as Rory was saying, there is not much substance in the proposals made by by China for the 12-point plan. So we were hoping that this visit could at least allow Xi Jinping to place just a phone call to Zelensky. He didn't do that, although he has a partnership agreement with Ukraine that dates from 2013, I believe, where they're supposed to protect each other's country against attacks from outside. He didn't respect this agreement. So no, I don't think this will change soon.
At about the same time, Dr. Monia, the Japanese Prime Minister was also in Ukraine. He was meeting the Ukrainian president and trying to, of course, in solidarity and to ensure that the world is standing with the country. The fact is, do you think that the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine somewhere took away the sheen from the Chinese president's visit to Moscow?
Well, that's a courageous visit from Kishida, because they have a lot of interest in China, and they have a lot of interest in Russia. They're buying gas. They have huge investments in China. And for him to step across the world and visit Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev was a stunning move, I thought. So credit to him. And I hope that this will make everyone think again about what Japan can do, but they're ready to make a strong statement.
Okay. Dr. Benjamin, there's been a lot of skepticism about the 12-point peace plan about China, and perhaps more so because of the statements that keep coming in from Beijing. And on this recent visit, they made a statement about the growing concern of NATO's presence in the Asia-Pacific. And they've hit out at the United States once again, saying they're still pursuing the Cold War mentality, and it is them which is disturbing the peace and stability. Now, this kind of statement about the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific strategy, particularly with a lot of countries being involved, how concerning is it?
Well, I think the Chinese have been complaining about that for many, many years. Certainly not new. The lie is that the United States are essentially the disturber of peace in what was once previously a very peaceful Asia-Pacific region until the United States decided to come roaring back during the pivot to Asia a decade ago. So I think the Chinese have been pretty consistent with that line. If you go by that logic, they are also criticizing the United States for being the one who is selling weapons to Ukraine and using that as saying, well, look, who's the one who is causing the war or prolonging the conflict? It's the United States, not us. So I think it is a kind of almost a case of demonizing the United States. And I think this is very much part of the Chinese narrative in the last decade or so, certainly much more intense in the last 3 to 4 years, but I think it is a continuity from Chinese concerns that the US is basically trying to interfere in matters relating to Chinese periphery.
But Dr. Smith, the fact that it in a way also justifies Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the fact that NATO's presence is being seen as a threat to security, not just by Russia, but also by China. It's being, connected to the security, the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of countries, and because of which, in a way, it's being justified?
Well, look, let me say first and foremost that peace agreements are great. We should be seeking to achieve peace in a variety of conflicts around the world. But I would be very cautious to describe China as a new peacemaker. Let's start with the peace agreement in the Middle East. The United States experience has been that signing peace agreements is really just the beginning of the process. So let's see how this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia really pans out in the long term. I hope it does. I really do. But let's just wait and see there before we crown China the new peacemaker. As for the 12-point plan for Ukraine, look, this is just a non-starter from the Ukrainian perspective. This legitimizes Russians' land grab, so to speak, in Ukraine. And this to forge an enduring peace here is going to take probably compromise from both sides, but let's see if China can get Vladimir Putin to compromise on any of his objectives within Ukraine. I remain highly skeptical, but nonetheless very much hopeful for peace.
Ms. Daniel, so let's talk about the future now. What we are currently seeing is that economic sanctions, perhaps a weaker Russia, has brought it closer to China. What we're also seeing is that bilateral trade between both countries has surged over the past 1 year. And particularly if we look at the energy trade numbers, they've soared. If Moscow finds its market in Asia, which it has already begun to do, and China's energy needs, of course, we are seeing are growing, and this economic partnership continues to bloom as we are seeing, what do the international sanctions then mean for Russia?
International sanctions are always have some unintended consequences. So in this case, the function of the sanctions has been to push Russia toward countries that are less concerned with the sanctions. That doesn't mean that China and Russia are violating the sanctions in any way. They're allowed to do bilateral trade under the current sanctions regime. But what it does signal, I think, is that China is very good at filling in vacuums where the U.S. has left in international relations. So in this case, as the U.S. and the West quit their trade with Russia, isolated Russia in the international financial and economic system, China was there to fill in that gap. I think over time that the China-Russia relationship is based on transactions and transactionalism and is not particularly, at this point, transformative in terms of creating some sort of unalienable block against the West. But we're certainly seeing trends to move more and more in that direction. And as the two countries become increasingly economically dependent on each other, if that ends up being the case, if China fills in totally the gap that has been left by the West as it pulled out of Russia due to international sanctions, then we're going to be in a very precarious situation where we are seeing a bifurcation of the international financial and economic system that could lead towards some of the more risky and potentially conflict-driven dynamics in the international environment where we would have two blocs competing in a Cold War style formula. We're not there. We're not even close. I have to note that US-China bilateral trade has also grown in the last year. It hit record numbers last year. But certainly these are trends that we should all be watching, we should all be interested in, and we should be thinking about what the long-term implications are.
Okay, Professor Mondia, the fact that Russia is, of course, found new markets in terms of its energy supplies. Europe, which was a lot dependent on Russia, how is Europe managing to fulfill its energy needs?
It's been nothing else but a miracle. We've reacted very quickly, and yes, the pipelines have blown up in the Nord Stream pipeline. We've reorganized LNG shipment from the United States, from Middle East, and we've gone through the winter without getting cold. So that is a remarkable agility from the governments, the leaderships in Germany in particular, because they don't have nuclear energy any longer. They just maintain 3 plants that they prolonged forward, but other than that, they're using some oil. And so that means, yes, Europe is able to readjust and live through without being hurt. Now, it is, of course, hurting general global growth. It is creating pain in many other countries, from food supplies to energy security. Things are tight, things are expensive. It hurts inflation for every country, north and south. So no, there's no good news out of the war like that. But yes, we've been able to avoid the wars.
Professor Benjamin, through this visit, what we are seeing, and with the kind of declarations that both sides have spoken about, both sides have, in a way, cemented their relationship. But does this also indicate that more and more sanctions on Russia, pushing Putin towards China, means China now has more leverage over Russia? And what does it mean for the China-Russia relationship in future?
Well, I think it was mentioned earlier that some of the part of this relationship is not something that is transformational. I would say that it's really much based on strategic interests, somewhat converging at the right place, right time, and it's very much transactional. It really remains to be seen long term how this is going to pan out. I do not think, and this is my own personal view, I do not think that China is going to place all its eggs, or at least feels that it needs to have Russia's back all the time. I think it's also conditional upon Russia meeting some of Chinese expectations, and particularly one of them, which would certainly include distracting the United States and Europe away from the Indo-Pacific, which and thus provide China with a bit more space to generate and to build up its influence in Asia, where I think it is primarily concerned with. So moving forward, I would say let's give it some time. The handshake doesn't mean that things would be all positive moving forward. There will be sure to be frictions going down the road. But I think at the moment, as we see, part of the strategic interest is really demonstrating some kind of authoritarian solidarity to what they view as Western interference into their own domestic regimes.
But okay, Dr. Smith, I'll take one last comment from you about the future of China-Russia relationship. And I ask a similar question to you, because I've heard a lot of analysts over the past week talk about how this visit only puts Putin deeper into President Xi's pocket. And they go on to talk about the increasing influence of Chinese interests in Russia in the face of international sanctions, and a lot to do also with Putin's international image. It all coincides with the ICC's arrest warrant as well. So what is your assessment?
My assessment is fairly consistent with that. I see Russia now firmly as the junior partner. I agree that this visit isn't in and of itself transformational, but I think the war in Ukraine broadly is and has solidified President Putin's position there as the junior partner. moving forward, I agree with some of the other panelists that this isn't necessarily hasn't created a completely decoupled world where it's a new Eastern Bloc, so to speak, against the West. But these things are developed incrementally. We wouldn't see a huge announcement that there's a new Eastern Alliance or whatever you want to call it. But I would be watching very, very cautiously because these relationships are developed over time incrementally. And this is another data point that points towards that broader trend of convergence amongst China and Russia in this marriage of convenience. But who knows, maybe they might find genuine love in this marriage to extend the metaphor.
Okay, time allows me to take up one final comment from Professor Benjamin as well. Professor Benjamin, this relates to the future of the war. The fact that, both sides solidifying their position to continue the war until it reaches, a final conclusion. The fact is that a lot of countries have suffered over the last few months. They continue to do so. And with the major powers reluctant to even discuss a solution, where do you see the war heading?
Well, I think it's very hard to predict how this will end. My view is that it is not China is in no hurry to actively sort of force Putin's hand to finish the war, as what I think our friends from Europe might wish. I do not think China feels that it has to rush an outcome because the longer this war prolongs, so long as it does not spill into China's borders, it is a generally good thing for China. It keeps the United States and Europe distracted. It keeps the rest of the countries very worried. And one must need to remember, Russia is China's biggest neighbor, and a weakened Russia can only be a good thing for China. So I think the way I see it, this is really going to be any outcome. It's not going to come from China. China is unlikely to take active measures. It would likely to be Putin and Zelensky and basically coming to some kind of agreement.
Okay, so the bottom line is, and when we go back to talk about President Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, as a lot of our panelists have suggested, the substance was lacking, but of course it was high on optics. Let's see whether and what kind of outcome it reflects on for both these countries in terms of economic relationship, but also in terms of ending the war, whether China has more to offer, whether it is acceptable to Ukraine and Russia both, and whether we see the war to end in the times to come, because it is in the larger interest worldwide. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have all four of you. And thank you to you viewers as well for your time. I'll see you same time next week now. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.